In the ongoing series of Art of Being Happy, today we will be talking on comparative perspective on interpersonal relationship. We will be covering the following subjects: Introduction to Comparative Perspective on International Relations and Interpersonal Relations, their cultural variations in the family relationship, collectivist versus individualistic cultures and relationship dynamics, high context and low context communication and relationship building, followed by social hierarchy in interpersonal relationship and the gender roles and interpersonal relationship in the different cultures. So let us start with the Introduction to Comparative Perspective on Interpersonal Relationship. Now, understanding how interpersonal relationships vary across many cultures and circumstances is the goal of the academic field known as Comparative Perspective on Interpersonal Relationship. Researchers in this area look into connections, exchanges, and interactions that occur within the relationship while taking into account like social norms, cultural influences, and environmental effects. The scholars seek to identify both the universal patterns and specific cultural variations that impact how relationships form and develop by watching the comparing interpersonal dynamics in the various contexts. Now, this field understands the importance of interpersonal connections in the human life and how they can be impacted by a variety of elements, including the family structures, gender roles, economic systems, and technological developments. Now, the researchers learn more about the complex interactions between the different cultural forces and individual behavior by examining these impacts in the other countries. Now, this information, it helps illuminate the importance of the context in determining how we connect with others and advances our understanding of the human nature. So, in the end, the study of comparative interpersonal relationships, it provides a wider perspective on the complex web of human connections, promoting intercultural sensitivity and deepening our understanding of what it means to relate to one another. Now, let us see the cultural variations in the family relationships. The family structures, customs, values, and behavior, they fluctuate across distinct cultures and the cultural groupings, and this is referred to as cultural variations in family relationships. Families are fundamental in forming the people's identities, socialization, and the general well-being, and they perform a variety of functions in many cultures. Among the most significant cultural variations and variances in the family relationship are: the first is family structure. The family composition varies by the culture. Some cultures value living together or close to grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, whereas other cultures value the nuclear families with the parents and the children only. The second factor is authority and hierarchy. The division of authority and the power within the families is governed by cultural norms. There may be more egalitarian family dynamics in some cultures where decision making is shared among the family members, whereas in others, elders or parents may wield significant authority and decision making power. The next is your filial piety. In some cultures, such as in many Asian societies, the filial piety is highly valued. This concept emphasizes the respect and reverence that children should have for their parents and the duty to care for the elderly parents in their old age. The next is your independence versus interdependence. The cultural norms may promote either intercultural interdependence within the family, emphasizing the collective goals and the shared responsibilities, or independence, that is, encouraging the individual autonomy and the self-reliance. The next is your rituals and traditions. The customs and traditions connected with the major family events such as wedding, births and deaths can actually show the cultural differences. These rituals frequently helped to reinforce the family ties and represents the values and the beliefs of a specific culture. Now coming on to these cultural differences in the family connections, they impact the people's identities, attitude and behavior in their communities. Thus, they must be respected. Now, understanding these variations can actually assist and foster the cross-cultural understanding and avoid the misconceptions while interacting with people from the different cultures. Now, let us move on to the collectivist versus individualist cultures and the relationship dynamics. The different approaches to relationship dynamics exist in collective and individualistic cultures, which are actually profoundly influenced by their respective cultural values and societal standards. Now, these cultural orientations, they influence the goals and the expectations that people have for their relationship as well as how they develop and maintain them. The next we have is the collectivist cultures. The collectivist societies such as those in many Asian, African and Latin American countries, they place more importance on the harmony and the well-being of the collective than on individual preferences. Now, the influence of the family, extended family and community on a person's identity and the choices is crucial. Relationships in these cultures tend to be more independent, interdependent, with strong loyalty to the family and in-group members. Now, coming on to the dynamics of the relationship in the collective cultures. The interconnectedness and interdependence are highly valued among the people in the collectivist cultures. They stress the group cohesion over individual goals and work to establish close ties with the family and the neighbors. The second is the group decision making. The major choices like marriage or profession are frequently made jointly with the advice of a family and the elders. The next is your harmony and conflict avoidance. It's very important to keep the group harmonious and to maintain the connections and the prevent societal upheaval. Conflict is frequently avoided or handled subtly. The next is your emphasis on obligations. People have a sense of obligation and responsibility for their family members, which may affect the decisions that make in life and cost they are willing to incur to ensure their well-being. The individualistic cultures, the individual autonomy, individual objectives and self-expression are prioritized in the individualist cultures, which are common in many Western nations like the United States and Western European countries. Now, in these cultures, there is a stronger emphasis on the wants and the goals of the individuals as well as on the personal achievement and independence. Next we have is the dynamics of the relationships in individualist cultures. The individuals in individualistic cultures, they frequently place a very high value on their own autonomy and ability to make decisions. Even if their own ambitions collide with those of the family, they may still pursue them. The next is your straightforward communications. People tend to convey their demands and the ideas in a more outspoken and straightforward manner. Next we have is a personal fulfillment. It is valued and people may put their own interest ahead of the interest of the collective in their pursuit of happiness and self-fulfillment. The next we have is the individual decision making. Important life decisions such as those involving career or relationships are frequently undertaken by individuals alone with little or no family influence. Now it is very important to remember that these cultural orientations are relative and that many societies have a blend of collectivist and individualist characteristics. Additionally, the effects of technology and globalization are increasingly changing the global cultural dynamics and connections. Now, in an increasingly interconnected world, being aware of these cultural distinctions, they promote the cross-cultural empathy and effective communication. It also emphasizes the significance of taking a culturally sensitive and conscious approach to interpersonal dynamics. Let us now move on to high context and low context communication and relationship building. The high context and low context styles are two contrasting styles of communication that significantly influence the relationship building and interactions in the different cultural context. The first is your high context communication. In high context communication, the cultures such as information and meaning are embedded in the context of communication rather than explicitly stated in the word spoken. Now, people in these cultures, they rely on the shared experiences, the unspoken cues and implicit understanding to interpret the message accurately. Let us start with the characteristics of the high context communication culture. The first is your implicit communication. The high context societies, they often imply meaning. People are supposed to understand the unsaid meanings and clues in conversation. The second is your high context civilizations employ indirect language to communicate. Now, instead of expressing their ideas or desires, they may hint, indicate, or hint. The third is your non-verbal communication. The body language, the facial expressions, the eye contact and the gestures, they are actually vital to the meaning in the high context societies. The fourth is your in-group focus. The high context communication often occurs within established social groups where the members have a shared history and the mutual understanding. Next we discuss is a low context communication. Now, in the low context communication cultures, communication relies heavily on explicit, direct and precise language. The emphasis is on standing and stating the information explicitly to avoid any misinterpretation. Let us start with the characteristics of low context communication. The first is your clear and direct communication. People use explicit language to convey the messages and avoid ambiguity. The second is your verbal expressions. The spoken or written words, they carry the primary weight in conveying the information. The third is your independence. The individuals are encouraged to be independent and self-reliant rather than relying on the group context to interpret the messages. The fourth is your individualism. The low context cultures, they often prioritize the individual needs and the goals over the group harmony. Now let us do what is the impact on relationship building. The first is your trust and the rapport. In the high context cultures, relationship building is often built on trust and mutual understanding that develops over time within the social group. People rely on the shared history and the cultural norms to establish the rapport. The next is your directness and the clarity. In the low context cultures, the indirect and a clear communication is valued in relationship building. Openly stating intentions and expectations, they help foster the trust and the understanding. The third is your miscommunication. Miscommunication can occur more frequently when individuals from high context and low context cultures, they interact, as they may interpret the messages differently due to their reliance on the different communication styles. The next is your adaptability. The successful relationship building in a diverse and a globalized world, it requires the adaptability and the understanding of both high context and low context communication styles. Now let us do the role of social hierarchy in interpersonal relationships. How position, power, authority, they affect the interpersonal dynamics within a social system is known as the function of social hierarchy in relationships. Now coming on to many civilizations, they have a social hierarchies which have a big effect on how people relate to one another, how do they communicate, and how do they take decisions. The positions of authority and influence are actually created by the hierarchical structure, which can actually influence how people interact with one another and the expectations they have for their interactions. Now let us discuss the key elements of the social hierarchies and their impact on interpersonal relations. The first is your power imbalance. In the social hierarchy, certain people or groups are in positions of authority that others are not. People with a greater status may dominate and exert more influence over those with the lower status in relationship as a result of this power disparity. The second is your communication patterns. The social hierarchies can actually affect how people in the various positions they communicate with one another. For instance, those of lesser rank may communicate with those in the higher positions in a more subservient and less assertive manner. The third is your social role. Depending on an individual place in the social order, the hierarchical structure provides them a particular roles and expectations. These positions have the power to influence how people act and communicate inside their relationships. The next is your making decisions. In the hierarchical relationships, decision making may be centralized with those in the higher positions having greater discretion over significant decisions. The lower level employees could not have much autonomy or input in decision making. The next is your status symbols. The social hierarchies frequently include the status markers or indications such as the titles, the uniform, or the privileges. Now these symbols, they have an effect on how people view and interact with one another inside the social system. So we can say that it is significant to remember that social hierarchy can actually play a different role in interpersonal interactions depending on the situation and culture. While some societies may strive for more egalitarian and democratic connections, some may place a greater emphasis on hierarchy and defer to the authority. Now additionally, the cultural shifts and the social equality initiatives, they might be established hierarchical systems to be the test and promote more egalitarian interactions, fostering empathy, respect, and effective communication in a variety of social contexts. It requires an understanding of how social hierarchy functions in interpersonal relationships. Now, people can attempt to create more inclusive, encouraging, and just interaction with others by becoming aware of how the power dynamics impact the relationships. Let us come to the last part of today's presentation, that is gender roles and their influence on interpersonal relationships. The gender roles are cultural expectations and the norms that specify the acceptable actions, obligations, and tasks for people according to their perceived gender. Now, these positions have a big impact on how people engage with each other. How do they communicate with one another and express themselves in social situations? Now, the cultural families and the social influences, they have a big impact on how gender roles are acquired and reinforced from an early age. Now, there are some key considerations regarding the role of gender in interpersonal relationship across the cultures. The first is your relationship formation. In most cultures, the gender role play a significant role in how individuals initiate and pursue the relationships. For instance, in traditional cultures, men may be expected to take a lead in courting and initiating the romantic relationships, while women are encouraged to be more passive. The second is your relationship roles. The gender roles often dictate some specific roles and responsibilities within the relationship. For example, in more traditional cultures, women may be expected to take a domestic and a caregiving roles, while men may be expected to be the primary breadwinner and decision maker. The next is your communication style. The cultural gender norms can influence the communication style in the relationships. In some cultures, men and women may be socialized to communicate differently, with men expected to be more assertive and women encouraged to be more nurturing and empathic. The next is your power dynamics. The gender roles can impact the power dynamics within the relationships. In the cultures with traditional gender norms, men may hold more power and decision-making authority, while women may have less in certain matters. The next is your emotional expression. The cultural gender norms can influence how emotions are expressed with relationships. In some cultures, men may be discouraged from showing the vulnerability, while women may be encouraged to be more emotionally expressive. The next is your LGBTQ relationship. In the cultures with the rigid gender norms, LGBTQ plus relationship may face unique challenges as they may deviate from traditional gender roles and the expectations. So all these parts are very, very important and pertinent in forming the relationship, interpersonal relationship that we have to keep in frame. Thank you very much.